Hey guys, tonight we begin a quiet walk through the sleek alleys and hidden layers of Japan's most misunderstood institution, the Yakuza. Not the movie kind with explosions and sunglasses, the real kind. Quiet, ceremonial, and sometimes more bureaucratic than criminal. If you're expecting high-speed chases, maybe turn on a different video. But if you're here for something slower, richer, and honestly weirder than fiction, welcome. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from. I love seeing that. Now dim the lights, put your phone on silent, and if you're lucky, maybe you'll hear a soft rain tapping outside your window. That'd be perfect, because tonight's story starts not in some neon-lit back alley, but in a quiet room with a sliding paper door. Tokyo, 1958. A man kneels on a tatami mat while another presses a needle into his back. Slowly, carefully, one prick at a time. The tattoo will take years, not days, not weeks, years. Because for the old-school Yakuza, ink wasn't art. It was armor. It hurt. It bled. It told a story that only other insiders could read. Dragons, koi fish, chrysanthemums, symbols meant something. Courage, loyalty, death. A full-body tattoo meant you had given up your claim to normal life. You couldn't go to public baths, couldn't visit your family, couldn't be just a guy anymore. But let's step back. The Yakuza didn't appear in Japan with machine guns and motorcycles. They started as gamblers, literally. The word Yakuza comes from a losing hand in a card game. Yakuza, 893, worthless. The people who drew those cards were seen as garbage, outcasts, drifters. But they made their own world, one of rules, of oaths, of structure. There were two main types, the tekiya, who ran stalls and sold cheap goods, and the bakuto, the gamblers who set up illegal dens. Both operated on the edge of society, but here's the twist. They offered order in chaos. In post-war Japan, the police couldn't be everywhere. So the Yakuza stepped in. They settled disputes, kept things quiet, protected the neighborhood at a price. They called themselves Ninkyo Dantai, chivalrous organizations, not gangs. Not criminals. They believed in hierarchy, in rituals, in silence. If you joined, you had to leave everything else behind. You got a sponsor, swore an oath, drank symbolic sake in a ceremony that felt more like joining a family than a syndicate. You became a kobun, a child. Your boss became your oyabun, parent. And that bond was serious. If the oyabun told you to walk into fire, you didn't ask why. You just hoped your shoes were good enough. The organization was built like a pyramid. At the top, the kumicho, boss of bosses. Below him, ranks like Wakagashira and Shategashira, fancy titles. But the message was simple. Know your place. Follow the chain, never act alone. But not all jobs involved violence. A surprising number involved clipboards, extortion, protection fees, loan sharking, quiet money, and paperwork. Yakuza groups kept ledgers, schedules, meeting minutes. In some offices, they even had business cards. One boss famously said that the best criminal is the one who never looks like one. Still, they weren't saints. The money came from pain, gambling addictions, broken kneecaps, and worse. But it wasn't chaotic. It was structured suffering. That sounds awful, but it's important to understand. The Yakuza weren't trying to overthrow Japan. They were trying to fit into it, like a shadow that moves when the light does. And for decades, they did. In the 1960s and 70s, Yakuza membership exploded. Some estimates put their numbers at over 100,000. They wore suits. They attended funerals in formation. They were both feared and oddly respected. People knew their offices, knew their names. Some even admired them, not for their crimes, but for their consistency. They represented something strangely comforting. In a changing Japan, they stayed the same, always bowing, always obeying, always watching. The police, of course, didn't like that. But there was a strange dance. Arrests were made, but not too many. Deals were cut. Information was exchanged. It wasn't love. It was mutual usefulness. And then came the bubble. The 1980s in Japan were strange. Strange in the way only a country can be when it becomes very rich, very fast. Tokyo's skyline rising like origami on speed. Land prices soaring until a square foot cost more than entire villages. Everyone was buying. Everyone was building. And the Yakuza were watching, not from the shadows, from the boardrooms. See, the bubble economy wasn't just about stocks and real estate. It was about illusion, illusions of control, illusions of stability. And the Yakuza, masters of illusion, saw their chance. They invested, bought construction companies, opened nightclubs, slid into real estate like ink into paper. Quiet, permanent. They didn't storm into banks with guns. They wore tailored suits, carried briefcases, and negotiated like lawyers. Bribes flowed like tea. Politicians smiled. No one asked questions. Everyone was getting rich. Even the police seemed unsure. What do you do when the bad guys act more polite than your neighbors? But beneath the polished shoes and fax machines, the old rules still applied. Violence never vanished. It just got more expensive. Turf wars broke out. Fingers were lost. Yes, fingers. Let's talk about that. In the Yakuza world, when you messed up, you didn't get yelled at. You performed yubitsume, self-amputation of the pinky finger, the tip first, then another joint if you failed again. Why the pinky? Because in sword fighting, losing it weakens your grip, makes you less dangerous. Symbolic disarmament, practical shame. But here's the twist. Many Yakuza members performed yubitsume even when it wasn't required. As an offering, a gesture of loyalty. Imagine slicing off part of yourself just to say sorry more convincingly. And these weren't fringe members. These were high-level executives. Men with suits worth more than your car, kneeling quietly in offices with towels and small knives, preparing to bleed for honor. It wasn't theater, it was belief. That pain balanced the scales. That loss restored harmony. That blood proved you still belonged. This mix of old and new, of honor and hedge funds, was the heart of the bubble-era Yakuza. They were criminals, yes, but they saw themselves as caretakers of order, as middlemen between chaos and profit. A businessman wants to evict a stubborn tenant? Call a fixer. A nightclub needs new security? A local group offers protection. No need for police. No need for lawyers. Of course, that protection came with conditions. Miss a payment? Windows broke. Doors burned. But often there were no threats, just a polite reminder, an envelope, a nod, a smile. Violence was a last resort. The best extortion feels like customer service, and the Yakuza, by this point, were experts. They held offices in plain sight. Some even had logos, public phone numbers, year-end parties with guests in tuxedos. Their magazines published poems, philosophy, and updates on membership changes. Imagine reading a newsletter that mentioned someone got promoted and also that someone got stabbed in the same paragraph with the same tone. But the cracks were showing. Too much visibility, too much ambition. The public was starting to notice. The murders couldn't be ignored. The intimidation spilled into politics, and the government, pressured and embarrassed, began to push back. Slowly, reluctantly, but firmly. Laws changed. Anti-organized crime legislation tightened. Banks froze accounts. Police raids became less ceremonial and more forceful. Suddenly, being a visible Yakuza wasn't powerful. It was dangerous. Offices closed. Members went underground. The golden age was ending. But the Yakuza didn't disappear. They adapted. That's what they do. They always adapt. They found new ways, new fronts, new shadows. Because even in a digital world, there's still a place for quiet threats and polite violence, especially in a country that values form over confession. And so the tattoos faded under long sleeves. The swords were replaced with contracts. But the structure, the logic, the rituals, still very much alive. By the time the 1990s rolled in, Tokyo had changed. The bubble burst. Money vanished. Land values collapsed like sand castles under high tide. One day, you were rich. The next, you were explaining to your wife why the house was actually owned by a bank in Sapporo. People cried. Stocks died. But the Yakuza, they adjusted. See, the collapse didn't break them. It simply made them quieter. They pulled back, cut ties, moved investments, started smiling more, talking less. And that's when they began disappearing, not in death, but in design. Their names vanished from buildings, their logos from doors, their presence from headlines. But they were still there, operating through shell companies, hiring lawyers, accountants, and sometimes priests. That's not a joke. Some Yakuza groups maintained chapels for blessings before big meetings. You never know when divine intervention might help a money laundering scheme go smoother. It wasn't religion. It was rhythm, tradition, a ritual that wrapped crime in ceremony. But make no mistake, this new era wasn't gentler. It was just less visible. If the old Yakuza were swords, the new ones were scalpels. Precise, cold, distant. You wouldn't see a man with a dragon tattoo storming a pachinko parlor. You'd get a fax or a phone call from someone who knew your mother's name and your bank account number. And if the threat didn't work, the lawsuit would. Because they hired lawyers now, real ones, suits and ties and polished shoes. The courtroom became just another battlefield. They'd sue businesses, use legal pressure to get their way, file injunctions, delay projects, tie up properties in red tape, and win. Sometimes no one even knew they were involved. A restaurant closes, a company folds, A deal falls through. No broken glass, no blood, just silence, and a signature. Meanwhile, the police tried to keep up. But fighting shadows is hard. They passed new laws, tried to ban Yakuza from owning property, tried to fine them for recruiting. Some prefectures went further, posting public lists of gang offices. Citizens could look them up, see who was operating in their neighborhood. But often, the addresses led to nothing. Empty rooms, quiet hallways, locked doors. Because the Yakuza knew. Attention was poison. Better to be rumored than reported. Better to be a whisper than a face. And yet, despite all that, they still had rules. Strange ones. A code, like always. No drugs, at least officially. No harming civilians. No targeting children. Those who broke the rules weren't forgiven. They were erased, quietly, sometimes in a stairwell, sometimes in a forest, sometimes just gone. That's part of what made them different. Other gangs rose and fell on chaos. The Yakuza lasted because of structure. It wasn't about greed, it was about belonging. Once you joined, you were family. That meant weddings, funerals, and New Year cards. It also meant that when someone wronged the group, you didn't take it personally. You took it collectively, and for a long time, that idea worked. The public, even if they hated the violence, respected the consistency. You could rely on a Yakuza boss more than a politician. If he made a promise, he kept it. If he gave you protection, he delivered. No delays, no excuses. Just quiet efficiency wrapped in menace. But time doesn't stop. Not even for old rituals. New technology, new surveillance, new attitudes. By the early 2000s, younger Japanese weren't drawn to the life. Tattoos weren't cool anymore. Obedience wasn't romantic, and risking prison for a dying hierarchy didn't appeal to kids who wanted Wi-Fi and air conditioning. Recruitment dropped, loyalty thinned. The older bosses started grumbling. Back in my day, they'd say, staring out office windows that no longer overlooked anything but parking lots. But grumbling didn't change reality. The empire of silence was starting to rust. By 2010, the word Yakuza still carried weight. But it no longer echoed the way it used to. The gangs were still there, still holding meetings, still whispering into phones and polishing office floors that hadn't seen sunlight in years. But outside, the world had shifted. Japan was moving on. Slowly, reluctantly, but steadily. Tattoos were now less terrifying and more trendy. Pop stars had them. Tourists asked for them. And the old men with full-body ink found themselves mistaken for retired bikers instead of feared enforcers. That stung, because the tattoos weren't decorations. They were declarations of pain, of loyalty, of belonging, and now they were misunderstood. Some Yakuza tried to adapt. They hid the art, wore gloves, used tape. Others doubled down, held meetings shirtless in back rooms as a reminder of what it once meant. But the public didn't care anymore. The youth didn't look up to them. The media didn't romanticize them. The only ones who still feared them were the ones who owed money or broke promises. But the structure was still there. The oyabun and kobun, the hierarchy, the meetings with silence and bowed heads, the envelopes with unmarked bills. The code of behavior etched deeper than any tattoo. Even if no one respected it, they still followed it, because structure gave them purpose. Without it, they were just criminals. With it, they were something else, something older. Still, the pressure from the government grew. New anti-Yakuza laws passed quietly, almost apologetically. No banking, no renting, no leasing, no insurance. If you were affiliated, even loosely, you were denied. Apartments, jobs, loans. Some hospitals even turned them away. A broken leg and a dragon tattoo could get you discharged. So, what did they do? Some retired, some fled, some hid, others reinvented. They used straw men, recruited foreigners, operated from offshore accounts, ran businesses that looked clean but weren't. Convenience stores, karaoke bars, real estate firms. They stayed quiet, but they stayed active. And yet, the old rituals persisted. Initiation ceremonies, funeral processions in black suits and silent rows, incense, offerings, tears, and no one took pictures, because even grief was private, controlled, packaged in tradition. There were moments of violence, of course, a stabbing in Osaka, a shooting in Kobe, but they were rare now, not because the Yakuza were softer, but because violence attracted light, and light was the one thing they couldn't afford. Some younger groups tried breaking away, formed splinters, looser, messier, faster. No hierarchy, no rituals, just power. But they didn't last, because chaos eats itself. The older syndicates watched from a distance. They didn't interfere. They didn't approve. They simply waited. And in most cases, they outlived the noise. Still, the police kept pushing. In some cities, they published maps of gang offices. Residents could check who operated where. It wasn't subtle, but it worked. Landlords got nervous, neighbors complained, and soon even long-time Yakuza offices were shuttered, not by raids, but by paperwork and public shame. Even weddings became harder. No photographer wanted to be seen snapping Yakuza ceremonies. No caterer wanted the risk. So, the celebrations grew smaller, more symbolic than festive. A room, a meal, a shared drink, and silence. But for the men inside, it still meant something. A new brother, a new commitment, another thread tied to the web that stretched back generations. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't powerful, but it was theirs. And that meant it mattered, because even as the world moved forward, some things remained fixed, like ink beneath the skin, or oaths made when no one else is listening. By now, most people assumed the Yakuza were gone, not officially, just quietly, faded like a photograph left in sunlight too long. The headlines slowed, the stories dried up. Even the rumors seemed tired. But anyone paying close attention knew better. The Yakuza hadn't vanished. They'd just stepped sideways, into a place where cameras didn't reach and paperwork didn't ask questions. They still held meetings, not in smoky back rooms, but in rented offices with frosted windows and neutral decor. The furniture was plain, the curtains always closed, phones on silent. Meetings began with a bow, ended with a silence. Business conducted with the same formality as always, just with less ashtrays, and the swords, still present, not carried, but kept, wrapped in cloth, hidden in drawers, symbols, not tools. Because in this world, you didn't need to draw a blade to prove you were dangerous. You just needed to show up, calm, polite, with a reputation that said more than any weapon could. The money came slower now, the industries tighter, the risks higher. But the methods remained. Loan schemes, construction bids, hostess clubs, places where cash changed hands quickly and questions rarely followed. They didn't need to control everything, just enough to keep the machine turning. And the punishments, when needed, were never loud. A car with slashed tires, a business permit delayed, a rumor spread with surgical precision. No shouting, no threats, just quiet reminders that certain names carried weight. Still, but not all groups thrived. Some crumbled, internal splits, disagreements over territory, generational rifts. The younger members questioned the old rules. Why bow? Why kneel? Why sacrifice when the world didn't care anymore? They wanted shortcuts, fast money, no loyalty, no code, just chaos. The elders resisted, held ceremonies, gave speeches, reminded them of the blood in the ink and the history in the names. Some listened, most didn't, and so groups fractured, became unstable. The balance shifted, not toward power, but toward exposure. Police exploited this, encouraged defections, offered protection, set traps, and one by one, formerly untouchable syndicates were named, fined, dismantled, not with guns, but with taxes, with frozen assets, with court summons and denied permits. It wasn't glamorous, but it worked. Some Yakuza fled to other countries, set up small operations in Southeast Asia. Others went underground, took jobs as consultants, ran businesses that seemed clean, but never forgot where they came from. The tattoos still hidden, the knives still sharp. And yet, in some corners of Japan, tradition persisted. Annual ceremonies honoring fallen members, altars with incense, bowls of sake, a folded suit on a chair no one sat in. These weren't shows, they were rituals, old patterns in a new world, reverence, not relevance. In Okinawa, some smaller groups focused on smuggling, quiet operations, harbors at night, containers labeled incorrectly, but they moved slow, always cautious, because one mistake could mean the end, not jail, not death, just erasure, being forgotten. And for the Yakuza, being forgotten was worse than defeat. There was pride in the name, in the lineage, in the silence, a belief that even as the world changed, there was value in staying consistent, in bowing even when no one demanded it, in finishing a job no matter how small. Because for them, crime wasn't chaos. It was duty, a strange, broken kind of duty. But cracks deepened, laws tightened, cameras multiplied, and Japan, slowly, was becoming a place where shadows had nowhere left to hide. The question wasn't whether the Yakuza would survive. It was whether they could still recognize themselves if they did. By the late 2010s, Japan passed a line it couldn't uncross. The anti-Yakuza laws were no longer symbolic. They had teeth, real ones. You couldn't open a bank account, couldn't rent an apartment, couldn't send your kid to school without a form saying you had no criminal ties. It wasn't just targeting crime, it was suffocating it. But with that came something strange. The Yakuza began to resemble something else entirely. Not a gang, not a brotherhood, but a memory. A fading echo inside office buildings with no names on the doors. Their power wasn't gone, but it was brittle, hard, cracked around the edges. Some groups tried public relations, issued press statements, claimed they were misunderstood, that they offered stability, that they protected neighborhoods, and in a twisted way, that used to be true. In the past, if your shop was being harassed, you didn't call the police. You called a man with a full-sleeve tattoo and a quiet tone. He fixed it. No questions. But now, that man was being watched. His phone tapped. His name on a list that made landlords shiver and banks freeze accounts before the first deposit. It wasn't justice, it was isolation. A slow unpersoning done through forms and silence, death by paperwork. So the Yakuza adapted again, not with guns or schemes, with lawyers. They fought evictions, sued newspapers, challenged regulations in court, and sometimes they won, because they still understood systems better than anyone. They weren't just criminals, they were organizers, meticulous, patient. They knew which judges to avoid, which journalists to ignore, which city offices closed early on Fridays. They played the long game, because if they couldn't operate in the shadows, they'd hide in plain sight, not with violence, with contracts. But cracks widened. Young men stopped joining, not because they feared the law, but because they saw no future, no glory, no path upward. Just fines, surveillance, and aging bosses reminiscing about honor over cold tea in drafty rooms. And the public, tired, bored. The Yakuza had become something between urban legend and civic nuisance. Not terrifying, just outdated. Like phone booths or paper maps. Something you pointed to, but didn't engage with. Still, not all groups faded evenly. Some fought back. Quiet turf wars flared, not with swords, with arson, intimidation, digital sabotage, fake businesses set up next to legitimate ones, a war of positioning, not of bullets, a game of who could outlast the rest without drawing attention. Police struggled to keep up. They knew the names, knew the locations, but enforcement wasn't about evidence anymore. It was about pressure. They leaned on landlords, on accountants, on distant relatives who just happened to sign a lease for the wrong office. And the Yakuza, in turn, leaned back. Politely, strategically, never enough to start a public scandal, just enough to say, we're still here. Then came a shift no one expected. Some ex-members, tired of the code, turned to television, wrote books, started YouTube channels. They told stories about rituals, about scars, about the day they cut off a finger and couldn't pick up a pencil after. Some of it was dramatized, but much of it wasn't. It was just sad. They didn't glorify it. They mourned it. They explained how the system promised power, but delivered loneliness, how loyalty meant abandoning family, how fear replaced pride. These weren't confessions. They were quiet funerals, spoken into cameras, uploaded by grandsons. And audiences watched, not out of awe, but out of curiosity, like studying a species thought extinct, wondering how it survived this long, and why it still lingered in corners no one cared to sweep. Because even now, even with the rules, the fines, the forms, the pressure, the Yakuza still existed, maybe smaller, maybe older, but still holding their meetings, still bowing, still holding on to a world where structure mattered more than success, where silence was sacred, and where losing a finger was just the beginning. In the modern age, the Yakuza found themselves surrounded by things they couldn't punch. Cryptocurrency, surveillance cameras, AI-based fraud detection, digital paper trails stretching back years, every message saved, every transaction flagged, every misstep stored forever. The old tools didn't work anymore. The blade was useless against the cloud. So they tried to adapt. Some invested in tech startups through silent partners. Others moved into semi-legal gray areas, crypto mining, online gambling, fake social media campaigns, not flashy, not loud, just persistent. Because power to them was never about visibility. It was about influence, and influence could now be bought in likes, comments, or a gentle push on an algorithm. You didn't need to bribe a mayor when you could quietly control 5 shell companies behind the server room of a karaoke bar. And no one noticed. Not right away. Not unless you knew where to look. And most people didn't. But not every Yakuza boss understood this world. Many were men in their 60s, still using flip phones and fax machines. Their world was tactile, contracts signed with stamps, promises sealed with drinks. They understood hierarchy, territory, but not the blockchain, so they delegated, trusted younger lieutenants to handle the internet. And sometimes that trust was misplaced. Funds vanished, accounts frozen, authorities alerted. Because online, one slip meant exposure. And the Yakuza were never built for exposure. They were built for shadow. Still, they didn't give up. That wasn't their way. They opened companies, counseling services, debt mediation, construction firms that technically weren't involved in anything illegal, but knew exactly which permits to delay and how much interest to charge before it became extortion. It was cleaner, smarter, less romantic. Gone were the swords, the tattoos rarely seen, the rituals performed only in whispers. The code still lived, but it was buried under layers of bureaucracy and burner phones. And the pain, still present, still expected, just internalized. Not everyone cut off fingers anymore, but shame carried weight. A failed job, a broken promise, a dishonored name. These things still mattered. But for those on the outside, the fear was fading. The Yakuza were now more myth than menace. Children in Tokyo walked past old offices and didn't even look up. Shop owners no longer bowed nervously when a black car stopped on their street. Most didn't know the names of the big families or care. And that bothered the elders, because reputation, once everything, now meant nothing. A younger generation saw no difference between an old Yakuza boss and a regular man in a cheap suit. The ink meant less, the silence less respected, the formality mistaken for weakness, and the hierarchy mocked. Inside the syndicates, arguments began, quietly at first, then louder. Some pushed for modernization, others wanted to return to old ways, purge the system, burn the dead wood. But without recruits, without money, without political cover, It was just noise. The old couldn't move fast enough. The young didn't stay long enough. Some broke off entirely, started their own groups, smaller, messier, often violent, no code. No ritual, just crime. These weren't Yakuza, not truly. But the public couldn't always tell the difference. And the damage they caused, it landed on everyone. Suddenly, politicians who once tolerated the old groups began pushing for complete eradication. Total removal, not just regulation, elimination. And the word Yakuza became a poison brand, a word that stopped conversations, that closed bank accounts, that erased futures. And the bosses, once powerful men in tailored suits, now spent their days avoiding cameras, avoiding phones, avoiding attention, because the structure they had built, brick by brick, was cracking, not from outside, but from within. And still they showed up to meetings, on time, in silence, shoes removed at the door, sleeves rolled to show clean arms, bowed at the right angle, spoke in soft voices. Because even if the world didn't care anymore, they did. Even if no one feared them, they remembered what it used to mean. Because some codes aren't written in law. They're written in habit. And habit is hard to erase. There are still places in Tokyo where the air feels older. Narrow alleys with flickering lanterns, tiny shops with wooden signs and no menus. If you walk far enough, quiet enough, you might pass a building with no name, no lights, just a single camera above the door. You might not even notice it, but someone notices you. Inside, the room is quiet, clean, floor polished, shoes lined neatly. Men sit in silence, suits dark, ties straight. On the table, tea steams gently. No one drinks it. It's not for thirst. It's for form. The meeting begins without words. Eyes speak first, then nods, then the business begins. This isn't a scene from history. This is now. Maybe not often. Maybe not in every city. But it still happens because the Yakuza never truly disappeared. They just changed rhythm, slowed their breath, waited for the noise to pass. Their names are no longer written on buildings. Their photos not printed in magazines, but they're in contracts, in whispers, in debts, in favors that can't be undone. Not every family survived, not every boss adapted, but the ones who did, they still operate, just not as gangs, as something older, something quieter. In Kyoto, an old man still makes calls once a month. He doesn't ask for money. He doesn't issue threats. He simply reminds someone what was promised and what was delivered. In Fukuoka, a florist shop moves more money than a bank branch, not with bags of cash, with slips of paper, with signals. And in Osaka, a dinner takes place every season. No agenda, no press, just 5 men, some of them rivals, sitting together, not to fight, but to maintain a kind of balance, not peace, but something close. These aren't the stories that make headlines. They don't involve sirens or shootouts, but they matter, because they show that some systems survive not because they win, but because they know how not to lose. And the Yakuza have always been experts in survival. Their tattoos fade, their offices close, Their sons choose other lives, but the code, for those who remember it, still holds. The bow still matters, the silence still speaks, and the weight of a broken promise still lands heavier than a courtroom sentence. Some younger members try to revive the old ways. They hold meetings, recite the oaths, but they don't carry the same fear, the same history. They didn't grow up with newspapers listing the names of men you never met, but always respected. They didn't see their uncles disappear for years and return thinner, quieter, more careful. They only know echoes, and yet those echoes shape them. They speak softer, watch longer. They know that being loud is dangerous, being seen is worse, and being predictable is fatal. So they learn from what's left, the fragments, the rituals, the pauses between sentences. Because in a world that changes faster than anyone can control, the Yakuza offer something strange, a pattern, a script, a way to behave when nothing else makes sense, not because it's right, not because it's good, but because it's known. So if you walk down a street and see a man with a quiet posture, a calm face, and too much politeness, you might wonder. You might never know. He might just be a manager, or a shop owner, or a ghost, because the Yakuza no longer walk like thunder. They move like dust. And in the shadow of Tokyo, not all the lanterns have gone out.